Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to CRAM. Thanks for joining me as we explore new and innovative research and big ideas that may change the way you think and act. Well, the pandemic has caused us to mourn in different ways. We miss the life we had, the ability to move freely, and we long to see loved ones. In our hearts, though, we believe we'll return to some form of our previous life. But what is mourning like when you permanently lose a way of life and the home and community you and your family were a part of for generations? This is the legacy of climate change, and it's one being experienced by possibly thousands of people around the world. Ashlee Cunsolo is a researcher who's been studying this unique form of mourning, or ecological grief as it's known. She's the founding dean of the School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies at the Labrador Institute of Memorial University, and it's located in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador. And she joins us. Hello, Ashlee.
Hello, Mary. It's great to talk to you.
Yes, thanks for joining us. So why don't we start off, first of all, and explain what is ecological grief?
So ecological grief is an emerging concept that really looks at the ways in which people feel loss, mourning, grieving in response to a change in the natural environment. So it could be something like the loss of a beloved ecosystem, of a species, of a body of water, but also on a larger planetary scale where people are looking at what climate change is doing. So it can be something that you're directly experiencing. It can be something that you know other people are experiencing and you're kind of feeling that shared grief and loss. Or it can be for, anticipatory changes that we know are coming based on what we're experiencing, what we know about science, and what we see projected in the coming years.
Now, you say it's an emerging term. Is it emerging in the sense that there's sort of this new aspect to it because of climate change? Because it strikes me that, according to your definition, this has been something that's been going on through humankind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm always really, wanting to stress that this isn't the feelings and the emotions behind it are not new. People's connections to the land, to the environment, to ecosystems are, as old as humanity. And our mental wellness and our emotional wellness that comes from that connection is a long understood understanding and concept. What's shifting now, though, is with such rapid changes with climate change and with the resulting environmental shifts, is this kind of need for new terminology or new lexicons that bring together what we know for thousands of years has happened, this human-environment relationship, and start to identify it in a new way within the rapid changes, and particularly coming from people who are at the front lines of climate change, who are experiencing this on a daily, a weekly, and a monthly basis.
Yeah, it is so true. I mean, it's been there, but we didn't know how to describe it. I mean, even when I brought up that term ecological grief to, friends and colleagues, they were, what is that? I haven't come across it. And yet it seems to be catching on, hasn't it? I mean, I think it's being used more and more. And I don't know with yourself, because this seems like a relatively new field of study. How did you get interested in this in the first place?
Yeah, well, that's a really fascinating story. And it is, I'll start with, it is becoming more and more a popular term. And I think, when people hear it, it's like it suddenly resonates and they're saying, yes, that's what I've been feeling. I've had these sense. I thought I was alone. I didn't know. But as soon as there's a term, then people can go, oh, this is a thing. Like what I feel, I'm validated. This is real. And I can pay attention to it and start to attend to it and talk to people about it. And so my journey towards this was actually, it started in 2008, and I had the opportunity to join an already ongoing research project that was led by the Rigolet Inuit Community Government, which is here in Labrador and the Nunatsiavut land claim. And they have been working for several years on a really amazing project looking at climate change and water and the impact on human health. And from that, they thought, we really want to explore what's happening physical, mental, emotional, and spiritually to people in Rigolet. And what's really important to know about Labrador is it's actually one of the fastest warming places in Canada and one of the fastest warming in the world. So Inuit in particular in Labrador have long been at the front lines of a changing climate. And so when people talk about, this is what we're going to see, or we need to keep it below 1.5 degrees, Labrador has already warmed past that. And for decades, people have been experiencing things that in other parts of the country are anticipated to come in the future. So, it's a ton of experience, but also a lot of knowledge about how to live in a changing climate, how to adapt, and what was happening. So the community was looking to add some storytelling and qualitative research, and have a team of Inuit and non-Inuit researchers talking to people in the community. Like, what were they seeing? What were they experiencing? And it was from that work that this started to emerge. And, when we initially started the research, it was health broadly framed. And there was this really key moment that happened in March of 2010. Actually, it was a really pivotal moment in the research. And I was talking to one of the elders, Sarah Bakey, was one of the keys of the research lead as well. And we were looking out at the frozen water and talking about what she had seen over her lifetime and all the changes and everything that was happening. And so we went through all that. And then I sort of paused and I said, well, how does that make you feel? And I think it was the first time that we moved from sort of observations to emotions. And I remember her, looking out the window for a long time and then starting to cry. And talking about how, all this science and all these researchers and everyone have been documenting what people were seeing, but not what it was doing to people emotionally and how it was impacting people. And so that changed kind of the course of how we started to ask questions, what our team was doing. So a lot of the Inuit researchers were really digging into, how does this affect all aspects of your lives? How does it affect your emotions? And so, we worked with over 80 people from about 9 years old to over 80 years, all, experiences on the land, multiple gender identities, all different ages. And what really came out was this testimony of emotion, of loss, of grief, of sadness, of fear, of frustration, and this whole different way of explaining what climate change was actually doing to people. And to people who had generations of a connection to the land. And that's where grief started to emerge in the discussion. And so that's how I moved into it. It was from the voices and the stories of people here in Labrador.
In I guess a broader context, you and other scientists have said that we are actually in a new geological era called the Anthropocene, right? I mean, what does that mean, this new term?
Yeah, it's a term that's used to sort of show a new epoch in in geologic history, to really show the time period in which humans started intervening in the landscape and in the climate and the environment so much that we're now the dominant species that's making shifts. So there's all different kind of starting points. Some people say it's the Industrial Revolution. Some people link it to the end of the Second World War. Some people link it to nuclear proliferation. But it's this sense that particularly right now, we are doing so much to alter the climate and environment that there is this new kind of era that we're in. And when you look at it from a climate change and ecological grief perspective, that era also is like an era of loss and damage. So that we know as we're moving forward, we've already lost a number of species and we've altered ecosystems. And so as we move forward, we know that we're going to be characterized by more and more loss. And with that loss comes more and more grief and more mental and emotional responses.
So that term seems to have a huge negative overlay. I mean, it's not as if our impact has been good. It sounds like it's been all bad.
Yeah. And I think that's what it's trying to show is that, if you look at all of the other kind of geological times and epochs that have happened, this is a time where humans are actually fundamentally changing the atmosphere, the environments, the ecosystems. And that, that has very negative ramifications. And as we see from all the climate science, we see from the alerts that are coming out of like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have very few years left to act before we're facing increasingly catastrophic changes around the world.
And when you started this research back in, I guess, around 2010 or so, there wasn't a lot going on ecological grief back then, right? I mean, this was kind of at the forefront. And here you were, you were looking at a community of 80 people, the Inuit. What about today? I mean, what kind of examples do we have today of ecological grief around the world?
Yeah, it's certainly been growing. So when we started in 2009, there were a few studies that had come out of Australia looking at, similar climate change and mental health, particularly related to drought. And that was about it. Every once in a while you would see something that was on climate change and health, and it would have one sentence that said, and there may be mental health impacts. And within the last 10, 11 years, we've seen a huge proliferation of more and more published research, but importantly, more and more people either writing about themselves, more and more media coverage. You're seeing it more in the public discourse. And that's when I always find it when terms take off in the public and they resonate, then that's a really good indication of kind of where people are experiencing things. And, particularly over the last 5 years, we've seen a huge increase in the terms ecological grief and ecological anxiety in their usage. You can see it in sort of internet searches, in publications, in media reviews. We're really seeing this growth. And I think what we need to take it seriously, because it's one of those really interesting moments in time where the lived experience of people has far outstripped what's in the actual scientific published literature. So there's always a lag in publishing, and you do the research and then you publish, and that takes time. But we're seeing now in this field, particularly ecological grief and climate change and mental health as a whole, what people are coming forward with as like lived experience testimony is much more than we're able to capture right now in the published literature. So there's so much going on and there's so much happening, but we still don't really know the prevalence around the world. We don't know who's being impacted the most, how severe it is. Like there's so much still to learn. But at the same time, while we're trying to learn it as researchers, there's very real human suffering that's happening. So we also need to act as though climate change and mental health is a key priority.
Well, so you mentioned Australia and what's happened there as an example. What about Canada?
Canada has so many things that have been happening over the last few years where we're really seeing people come forward with a whole variety of mental health, emotional health, and ecological grief responses. I think you can look at the wildfires that we've had, particularly on the West Coast, flooding that's been all across the country over the last few years, particularly the recent ones in BC. We've had so many extreme storms and weather events. And then across the north, you see the sea ice loss and the change in snow and ice conditions. And all of those experiences, you're seeing more and more discussion, not just around the physical damage or, the loss to houses, but also how people are coping mentally and emotionally. And whether that's in the immediate moment, if there's, something like a really acute disaster, like a wildfire, or whether it's the longer term chronic things like a daily, monthly shift, like sea ice loss, or things where people are, it's 6 months, a year, 2 years after the traumatic event, and how, levels of anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder things are continuing to rise. So I think we see a large, many, many things across the country that people are linking their own mental and emotional health to. And I'm actually just starting with a team of researchers from the University of Alberta as well. We're trying to do a national survey around climate change and mental health to see if we can get a better sense of how, like, what is the prevalence of how many people are experiencing this across the country? Do we know? Are people able to link this? So we're hoping within the next couple months to have that as a random national survey to get a better sense of a snapshot of what's happening across the country at this time.
Mm-hmm. And when I think about your work with that community of Inuit, those were 80 people, but I know you've spoken to hundreds of people about the impact of climate change and how they're experiencing this ecological grief. Was there anything that struck you that might have been sort of a common experience or a common feeling that they had?
Yeah. So the initial research started in the community of Rigolet, which has 300 people. But there's 5 communities in Nunatsiavut, and the biggest one is Nain with just over 1,200 people. So after the initial 2-year study, we thought, let's work with the Inuit community governments of all 5 communities to see, is this something that's only happening in Rigolet, or is this something that's happening throughout all 5 communities? And so we had a team of Inuit researchers in each community, and they interviewed people and talked extensively and did a number of land trips. And we also made a documentary film called Lament for the Land. And what was really amazing about that was, no matter the age or the gender or the community, it all aligned around people's deep connection to the land. That sort of, people described it as kin, as family, as a part of themselves, just so much of who they were and who their ancestors were. And that even subtle alterations in climate. And so, we're talking about small things. And then now with climate change, we're seeing really large impacts that was directly impacting their mental and emotional wellness. And so, young people were saying this, elders are saying this, the middle generation, all of the general experiences of having someone, lose their ability to go out on the land when they want and how they want, or create unsafe conditions if they were out with changing weather or ice patterns. So that was sort of the general piece. Was there was so much alignment and resonance and consensus among people. But what was really interesting was the middle-aged adult males. They really came out with some very powerful stories and testimonies about how they were just feeling lost. They had a lot of people use the term empty time. So before, they were raised on the land, they were hunting, they were fishing, they were trapping, they were supporting their families, they were supporting the community with food security. That was their identity. That was who they were. It was their passion in the world. And then a lot of the adult males were sort of saying, now that's being taken away from us. And there was a particular year, the 2009-2010 winter, where there was very, very little ice formation at all. So only about 3 or 4 weeks of stable ice conditions where people felt safe going, rather than sort of 6 months. And that year, people talked about how they felt that their identity was stripped away from them, that they really didn't know how to spend their time. They didn't feel they were contributing to family and community. They felt lost. And what really struck out, besides the just sheer, human emotion and loss, is at that time when we were looking at global literature, it's generally women who are identified as most vulnerable in the climate change and health literature. But here, what we were seeing was actually this middle-aged adult male population who just didn't suddenly feel that they had that same opportunity to contribute in the way that they previously had.
And would that be because their roles traditionally are sort of defined along traditional gender roles, where the men would go out to the sea and, to do whatever they needed to do to get food, to hunt, to trap, that sort of thing? Yeah.
And a lot of the men that we talked about said, my grandfather, my father, everyone who came before me, and they had grown up on the land. They had grown up hunting and fishing. That was who they were. And that was their contribution to community and how they kept their families healthy and well, and how they kept their communities well. And that disruption, right, is so existential. Yeah. It's so deep. It's not a disruption to something like a hobby. It's a disruption to who you are and who you have been for thousands of years as a people.
And that phrase that you use, that they said empty time, to me that infers a kind of purposelessness, like they're empty, right? There's no purpose. And that's so tied, I guess, to our identity, right? To have a purpose in life.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
To have that taken away from you.
That's exactly what people talked about. Purposelessness came up a lot. A sense of like, what do I do now? Who am I now? Like, what's my ability to positively contribute? And, a number of people also use the phrase, like, feeling like a caged animal, that they couldn't get out on the land and they couldn't go to the places that they loved, and they didn't have that freedom that comes from, being out there. And there's this really amazing thing when you're in places where the sea ice forms, like Labrador or across the north. It's like the ice becomes a highway and everybody waits. And there's this anticipation for the cold to come in, for the ice to form. And it's a celebration, as someone who grew up in Ontario in Southern Canada, like when the winter came, people were kind of grumbly about it. There wasn't this excitement. Whereas, living in Labrador now and working here for the past 10 years and working with people, you see this everybody waits. It's this joy. And when the ice freezes up, and well, it used to be the fall, now it's getting later, it's like everybody goes to the ice because it's a freedom. It becomes a highway. You leave the community, you can hunt, you can go to other communities, you get together with family. And the wellness and the opportunities to be out there and to connect with people and to connect with the land, there's nothing that compares to it. There's nothing that comes close to people. And so that sense of when that's taken away or diminished, people are not only losing, the ability to hunt and feed the family, but they're losing a mental wellness support. They're losing a sense of culture and identity, that sense of freedom, that ability to get out and to move around. So it's so multifaceted. And, I always come back to this one quote that's in the documentary. Tony Anderson, he's one of the community leads in Nain, but at that time he was Angie Ukok, and that's mayor of the community. And he says at the end of the film, Inuit are people of the sea ice. And if there's no more sea ice, how do we be people of the sea ice? And that to me, and I still get shivers every time I talk about it, because the existential identity thing there that is, for thousands of years, Inuit have been people of the sea ice. And then what happens if in a generation or two generations, because of climate change, because of external forces, the sea ice is either gone or greatly diminished? Like, how does that affect your identity and who you are in the world and your cultural right to have access to ice? Silawat Kluche, an amazing Inuit activist and advocate, writes about the right to be cold. She has a beautiful book on it that talks about, the right to be cold is actually a fundamental human right that Inuit hold because of their where they live and what they've done for thousands of years. And that it's actually a human rights issue that climate change is taking that away. And so I think that's that, and connected to Tony saying, like, if there's no more sea ice, how do we be people of the sea ice? Like, that loss, that identity, the existential, who am I in the world? And then the fear of what that means for generations to come is very, very important for people to understand and realize just how much that impacts us. And it's certainly, my research is in Nunatsiavut and working with Inuit here, but we're seeing this all over the world. It's many Indigenous peoples are talking about this. Farmers, we're seeing farmer mental health research come out where people are talking about their identities. So it's something that is resonating and that more and more people are unfortunately experiencing because they're on the front lines of a rapidly changing climate.
Yeah. And, you talked earlier about a new language and new terms to describe what's going on. We're familiar with the term nostalgia, which is, that sentimental longing or affection that you have for the past. But then I saw this new term that has come up, solastalgia. Is it? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that. Yeah. Solastalgia. Yeah. Talk about that term.
Yeah, this is an amazing term coined by the philosopher from Australia, Glenn Albrick. And Glenn was working with a variety of people on how environmental change was impacting their home environment. And people identified, being in place, still being at home, but the environment changing around them so much that they felt a loss and a homesickness. So the term itself basically means a homesickness while still at home. And it's such a powerful new term. And Glenn's recent work, he's doing amazing work. He's got a great book called Earth Emotions, where it's looking at how we create new terms to identify the new era that we're in. So these complex emotions, like the idea of being homesick while still at home, we don't have one word for that. So he's trying to create this new lexicon. And, when I first encountered that term back in 2009, it was after the first kind of information of the communities were sharing were saying, there's so much mental health related to a changing climate that we didn't expect. And so, community leaders were saying, well, are we the only ones? Are there other people talking about this? Go find out. And so I started doing research, and Dr. Albrick's stuff was some of the only pieces. And so when he created that term from an Australian example. So very different geography, very different climate, very different populations that he was working with. And when I took that term back and sort of explained it to people in Labrador, people said, yes, that's exactly what's been happening, is like we're at home, but home is changing, and we feel homesick for for what home used to be, for that past, for a different type of climate. And some people even talked about feeling disoriented. Like the environment is so different now that I'm disoriented, but I'm at home and this should be familiar, but the weather is not familiar. The land is not familiar. Things are shifting. And what do we do? And I think that's that kind of idea that we don't necessarily have to leave home to still miss what it used to be is where that power of the solastalgia term comes through.
And I also wonder, and you said that you're embarking on a study looking at, I guess, the impact of ecological grief across the country. How does it work its way through different degrees of connection, right? Because you tell us about these communities who've been directly impacted, their way of life for generations, hundreds of years. And then you have perhaps urban people who, are not in that kind of situation at all. They're not living off the land. And yet they perhaps are feeling the effects of climate change as well, an anxiety, a depression, a sadness. So can you talk about that, about the degrees that it can work its way through?
This is such an important thing for what we're finding is that people experience ecological grief and anxiety in so many different ways. And so just as you said, there's a lot of people who are not necessarily at the front lines, not necessarily have experienced a traumatic event, but still have the feelings of loss and grief and anxiety because they either see what other people are going through. Humans are very, we're social and emotional. So we can pick up the emotions of others. We can put ourselves in the place. We can watch horrific events happen and feel emotion. And then the other key piece is with so much climate science out there and so much information, particularly among young people, so many people are talking about this idea of anticipatory loss and anxiety, knowing what's coming. And knowing what people will grow up into and feeling already that sense of loss. And so, I think there's obviously different degrees. So if you experience a traumatic event like a wildfire or flooding, or, you're up in the north and your way of life is changing, that's obviously a very acute experience. And in some cases can be quite severe and requires a lot of support and care to take care of your mental health. But it doesn't mean that people all over aren't experiencing varying degrees of it. And, in many cases, what we're seeing is people are unsure of how to identify their own emotions when they're not at the front lines. And so, and it's almost like people feel guilty or embarrassed. They'll say, well, I feel really, really anxious and stressed, but I know I shouldn't because I know there's people who have it much worse. Or, and so instead of acknowledging and kind of validating where they're at, it's almost a shame of oh, well, I shouldn't feel that because, I'm not being directly impacted every day. And I know there's other people suffering. And so it's somehow finding ways that people can, that everyone can be validated, and then different supports and different resources for different experiences can come into play there.
Well, it makes me wonder too about someone like yourself. I mean, you said, here you were a young woman from Ontario, and now you're doing all this work in Labrador, working with these different communities and seeing firsthand. I mean, you may not have experienced it firsthand, but you are seeing it. You're talking to these people. You must in some way be feeling the impact that they're going through. How does that affect you?
Yeah, this is something, it's something I've grappled with the whole way through. So going back before I started doing this work, my first experiences as a person in the world with grief were actually related to environmental grief and loss. And so the first times that I really understood as a child what loss and pain were actually before I had experienced human loss. And so I've always had this kind of, this connection and these emotional ties and been really fascinated by the ways that humans and environment are so deeply connected. And so, and I'm also, as a human, I'm very, I can absorb other people's emotions very easily. And so have to be very careful with my own health and wellness. And so when I started doing this work, and especially while I was working on my PhD, so, I spent 4 years working intensely with people hearing, incredibly beautiful and incredibly powerful and strong and painful stories. And so, when you're writing something like that, you're immersed in it, you're working with people, you form deep friendships and relationships. And so people that you really care about are suffering. But also, in order to write something like that, you're immersed in people's words and voices all the time. And so I was listening to recordings, I was reading transcripts, I was thinking, I would go for a walk and have headphones in and listen to. So it was all the time. It was all encompassing. And what was really fascinating is how painful I found it. But as I had said before, I'm one of those people that thought, well, I don't have a right to be sad or to grieve or to feel pain because I am not at the front lines. People have it. This is their culture, not mine. And so for a long time, I didn't attend to my own emotions of loss and grief and of being surrounded by other people's pain and my own, and I think that's one of the things when you do this type of work, and anyone who's working in ecology or climate change or environment, like you're surrounded by the pain of the world, but every day you're in it because you love it. Right. And so anyways, what ended up happening was I developed like a really unusual, it was almost like pinched nerves in my forearms and I couldn't type. So, if you're trying to write a dissertation and you're trying to write a PhD and you can't type, like that stops you from doing your work. And this went on, I had tests and no one could figure it out. And so I was ended up talking to an elder and sort of explaining what was happening. And he said, well, you're not letting your own grief out. Like you're not letting yourself matter in the story. Like yes, you're telling the story of others. And yes, you're here to share other people's voices, but you've got to deal with your own emotions. And so that set off, it was almost like I needed someone to give me permission to actually grieve. And as soon as I did that, everything cleared right up. And I was able to get back and do the work, but it was such a powerful lesson because grief is so embodied. Like we know our emotions are so connected, but it also reminded me of like everyone matters. And it started a particular interest in how other researchers and scientists were dealing with this because, like when you're studying a species or, there's a wonderful example called reef grief of people who are studying the Great Barrier Reefs and the coral reefs all over, and they tell these horrific stories of going back like the next year and just, hundreds of kilometers being bleached and dead and what that does to them, that for year after year they're studying and then it disappears. And you look at people who are studying, key species and ecosystems, and they do it because they love it. And then when you see the loss, even though you're studying it scientifically, there's a human pain there. But, scientists aren't generally expected to talk about their emotions or to say that it's a struggle for them or that it's scary or that what they're watching, you're supposed to almost dispassionately publish on your work. But underneath it is the human experience of like, you're studying it because you love it and then you watch it fall apart in front of you, and what that does to you.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand how, you have to take care of yourself in order to do this work, right? I understand what that elder was saying to you, that you needed to release that. What about these communities? I can't even imagine what would be the kind of support that they would need, I don't know whether it's a certain kind of therapy or support because they don't have control over what's happening. And it's not as if you can just go and fix it. Like this is their environment and it's permanently being eroded.
Yeah. And people have been working so hard on caring for their own communities. And, one of the things that I've really seen through this research is we didn't just want it to be kind of a documentation of what people are experiencing, but also what do people want done and what can be done. And so what so many people talked about was wanting more opportunities to do safe land-based activities to get them out as much as possible. So if even if the weather was changing or it was for shorter periods of time, and to make sure that particularly young people had the opportunity to learn from middle-aged and elders, to keep those skills alive. So one of the programs that we started in 3 communities of Rigolet, Makhovik, and Postville was called the Culture Connect program. And it linked a whole bunch of land skills. So there was things like snowshoe making and, making parkas and making sealskin boots and slippers, learning how to fix a skidoo. There's all different activities. And the youth got to learn from very prominent, particularly middle-aged people in the community of how to do all these skills. And so had a connection to culture, to learn new skills, to meet new people, well, not meet new people, you tend to know the people, but to get to know them on a different level and really come together and celebrate what it meant to be in the community and to do what they love. And so finding ways for people to still have that connection to culture and land, even if the environment is shifting. So you're seeing the communities do more and more supports and resources like that. A lot of focus on like Inuit and Indigenous specific mental health supports. So something that's not from a Western lens, but really understands what people need to be healthy and well when you're living in the North. So there's lots of different things that people are doing and that people are working so hard to care for themselves, their families, and their community. And you're seeing this sort of, people around the world are grappling with this. Like, what does mental health resources look like when you're supporting someone dealing with climate anxiety or ecological grief and anxiety? And there's lots of people doing this really important clinical work. And what does it look like? How do you train nurses? How do you train doctors? How do you train psychiatrists and psychologists and counselors with a climate lens? And how do we deal with youth in schools, whether it's elementary, high school, or university who might be experiencing, climate anxiety or ecological grief. So there's so much that we, it's like we need to learn new language and new skills to deal with this kind of ongoing loss.
Yeah. And I think so many people just find it overwhelming. And when it becomes overwhelming, it's paralyzing, right? Because you just think, what can I do? Who am I? This is so huge. And it's like this force, unstoppable force. And yet, you've talked about something called the gift of grief. Which it seems to me to be sort of a paradox, but explain, what is the gift of grief?
Yeah. And this is something, because people always say, like, how can you stand studying something so sad all the time? Like, how can you be immersed in grief? And, it is difficult. Absolutely it is. But the reason why I'm so drawn to it and why I feel such a connection to it is because what's on the other side of grief is love. And when you grieve, it tells us so much about who we are, what we value, what we care about, who we are in the world, and what actually really matters. So when people grieve for the environment or a species or an ecosystem or, climate change in general, to me, I find that actually really hopeful, even though that sounds counterintuitive, because it means that they have a connection. It means that they're aware of the importance and the value. And so the gift of grief is actually understanding that our grief emerges from love. And if we can start to tap into that, like if we can get through the paralyzing piece, and that is very real. And we have to be really, really careful that we don't become paralyzed or isolated in our grief. Grief can actually bring us together. And it's almost like a community building, a community forming emotion, because we can connect with grief and remind ourselves that what it's actually teaching us is that the environment does matter. We are connected. We can make different choices. We can understand our place in the world in a different way. And, I think there's so much we can learn from Indigenous peoples all over the world, from people who are deeply connected to the land, that ethical community that you can form with humans and more than humans. It's not just, our relationships are not just with humans. It also extends to the natural world. And if we can tap into that and we can change how we see the world, that's where true sort of action and also healing, I think, comes from, that actually can give you strength to move forward in the grief and the anxiety and actually, mobilize it for like ethical and political good. And so, yes, it's painful, but we don't have to let it be paralyzing. But what I will say is if it does become paralyzing, then taking that seriously and seeking support is essential. But there's also ways to understand grief as like a politically mobilizing and community mobilizing emotion.
Yeah. So, I mean, based on all your experiences, everything that you've seen and heard from all these people you've spoken to, what's the message that you want people to know from what you've learned?
I think the message is to look at grief as a gift, to not be afraid of it. We know the climate is changing. I mean, we see it, we live with it. We know that it's projected to get much worse. So we are in an era of loss and damage. And I think one of the things that we can do is prepare ourselves, to be able to deal with the loss that's happened, to deal with the loss that's coming, and then really fight to stop more loss. Like that this needs to be a focus, is how do we diminish negative impacts on humans and more than humans? And one of the, there's many, many strategies, but from an emotional perspective, grief actually gives us a mechanism in which we can enter in and understand these things differently, and where we can actually come together. Judith Butler, the wonderful theorist, she calls grief the we creating capacity. Like it has this capacity to create we's instead of individuals. And so how do we come together in an era of loss and damage? How do we come together to support ourselves and to support our more than human kin? And what does that tell us about how we have to make decisions differently? What would like grief informed climate policies look like? How do we center other ways of looking at the world and other ways? So, I think grief is not something to be scared of. It's actually something that's a gift, and we can walk towards it and use it for good while we are also experiencing the challenges that it brings.
This has been a remarkably enlightening conversation, Ashlee. I really appreciate your speaking with us. Thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. It's always wonderful to connect on these issues.
That's Ashlee Cunsolo. She is the founding dean of the School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies at Labrador Institute, part of Memorial University. And if you'd like to see her documentary called Lament for the Land and find out more about her work, you can visit our show pages. Hope you enjoyed this edition of the Cram Podcast. And you might also be interested in our literary podcast called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and resolution, so you can end your day with Passage to Wonderland and maybe feel a sense of completion. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.